My name is Evelyn Mercer. I am 59 years old. That morning began like any other coffee gone cold on the kitchen counter. My son's message blinking on the phone. Have a good class. Mom, you've got this. I carried those words with me as I walked across the Portland State campus, pretending I didn't hear the laughter of students who could have been my grandchildren. Inside Professor Graham's psychology lecture, the air was steady and polite, the way it always was when he spoke. He was in his mid-50s, calm, composed, the kind of man who noticed small things like who sat alone, or who tried too hard not to be noticed. I usually took a seat near the aisle, second row, close enough to listen, far enough to disappear. They whispered anyway. "Why is she here?" One voice behind me murmured. Another laughed softly. "Maybe she's writing a book about us." I fixed my eyes on the notes in front of me, tracing the words developmental resilience. It felt ironic. Studying strength while pretending not to break. Halfway through the lecture, Professor Graham paused mid-sentence. His gaze moved across the room, resting on me for a heartbeat too long. Then he started walking down the aisle, his steps deliberate, slow, my pen stilled. He stopped beside my desk and set a folded piece of paper on my notebook. His voice was almost inaudible. "Read it. Now, for a moment." The sound in the room dulled. I opened the note with clumsy fingers. 6 words stared back at me. "Leave the classroom. Now, don't ask questions." I looked up. His expression was calm but strained, the look of a man holding something heavier than he could say. I gathered my things quietly. The chair legs scraped, and a few students smirked. Whispering as I rose, I walked to the back door, every step echoing louder than it should have. The hallway outside was cool and still. I closed the door behind me and pressed my palm to the wall, trying to steady my breath. Then it began shouts, chairs toppling, a sudden crash that made my heart skip. I turned just in time to see through the narrow window the dean, 2 uniformed officers, and faces twisting in confusion as they entered the room I had just left. And suddenly, the quiet class I thought I knew broke apart. The sound of that classroom still echoed in my chest long after I left the building. I sat in my car, hands gripping the steering wheel, watching rain slide down the windshield. My reflection stared back tired eyes, silver hair pulled too tightly. A woman who didn't quite fit where she was. I returned to college because of a promise I made to my husband before he died. Finish your degree. Eve, do something for yourself this time. I was 22 when I dropped out to work and raise our son. Now, nearly 4 decades later, I was back where I started, except everyone else was half my age and twice as loud. They noticed me the first day. "Did your GPS send you to the wrong building, ma'am?" one boy joked. Another girl whispered, "She's cute, like my grandma trying to text." Laughter rippled, and I smiled because it was easier than letting them see it hurt. Sometimes it got worse. During breaks, screens lit up with photos of me hunched over my notebook with captions like, "When you forget you're not auditing life." Only Professor Graham treated me as if I belonged. When he handed back essays, he'd say, "Your perspective adds something this room doesn't have." He said it quietly, but it stayed with me longer than any grade. A week before the note, I stayed after class to ask about a paper. He had smiled, folding his glasses. "Evelyn, never apologize for taking up space here. You earned your seat." That was the moment I believed him or tried to. Now, sitting in the car with my notebook still damp from the rain, I thought about those 6 words. Leave the classroom now. Don't ask. It felt like more than a warning. It felt like protection. I stood frozen in the corridor, my hand still on the doorknob. The sounds inside blurred together, shouting, chairs scraping. A command barked in a deep voice. Then came a crash, followed by gasps that made my pulse race faster than the storm outside. Through the narrow window of the door, I saw Professor Graham step aside as two police officers moved swiftly between the rows of desks. The dean followed close behind, face pale, voice sharp but controlled, and then I saw him. Chad Nolan being pulled to his feet. He struggled, his sneakers skidding against the tile. "This is insane. I didn't do anything," one of the officers said. "You need to calm down, son." Chad twisted toward the class. "You're all sheep. You think she's some saint? She's a freak." The word hit me even from the hallway. I pressed my back against the wall, the cold biting through my sweater like sharp reminders. Professor Graham's voice rose, steady but firm. "That's enough." Chad, for a moment, their eyes met teacher and student, fury against patience. Then the officers snapped the cuffs around Chad's wrists. He shouted something else I couldn't make out, but his gaze darted toward the back door, the one I had walked through only minutes earlier. When they led him past the window, his face turned, just slightly, and I saw recognition there. It made my stomach twist. Professor Graham stood near the desk, one hand braced against it, shoulders heavy. Around him, the students were whispering, some recording, some crying. I took a step back from the door. The air felt thinner, as if the hallway itself knew something had just changed. I didn't fully understand what had happened inside, but I knew with sudden certainty my presence had been the reason he had sent me out. By the time I reached home, my hands were still trembling. I locked the door, sat on the edge of the couch, and stared at the quiet apartment that suddenly felt too large. The phone lay beside me. I didn't want to call, but I knew Daniel would sense it anyway. He answered on the first ring. "Mom! What happened?" I tried to sound steady. "There was an incident in class. The police came." A pause. Then his voice sharpened. "Were you hurt?" "No," I said quickly. "Professor Graham told me to leave before it happened." Daniel exhaled hard. "That's not normal." "Mom, you shouldn't be the one walking into danger at school." "I'm fine," I said, though my throat felt tight. "It's just, everything happened so fast." He was silent for a moment. When he spoke again, his tone softened. "You've been dealing with those kids for months. The things they post, the way they talk to you, it's not right. You shouldn't have to prove yourself to them. I wanted to finish what I started." I said, "For me, for your father, I know." He whispered, "And you're brave for staying." "Mom, but you shouldn't have to fight alone." The weight of his words pressed against my chest. He was 32 now, a grown man. Yet the worry in his voice was the same as when he was 5, asking if I'd lock the doors when he slept. "I'll be careful." "I promised." "I'll hold you to that," he said softly, his voice steady as a promise. When the call ended, the silence returned familiar, but heavier. I sat there, clutching the phone, and wondered how courage keeps its shape once the whole world knows you're afraid. The next morning, I walked into the psychology building with my heart in my throat. The hallways were quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that follows after something people don't yet know how to talk about. When I reached Professor Graham's door, it was already open. He looked up from his desk. The calm I had always seen in him, the steady, patient kind, was gone. His eyes were tired, his posture tight. "Evelyn," he said softly, "come in. Close the door." I did as he asked, and the sound of it clicking shut seemed too loud. He gestured toward the chair across from him. "You probably deserve an explanation." I sat, gripping my bag. "I don't know what happened yesterday. I just know you told me to leave." And then he cut in gently. "That decision may have saved you from something you weren't ready to see." I stared at him, protected me from what Professor Graham hesitated. Glancing toward the window before lowering his voice, Chad Nolan was under investigation. The university security office and local police had been monitoring him for several weeks. I found out yesterday morning that they were going to intervene. My stomach turned. Because of me. His expression told me enough. It wasn't safe for you in that room, he said carefully. I couldn't tell you why. Not without risking the operation. I just needed you out before they arrived. I leaned forward, my voice barely a whisper. He said things about me. Didn't he? He didn't answer right away. He targeted you. He admitted finally, I wish I could give you more details. But for now, the less you know, the better. For the first time since I had met him, his hands trembled slightly as he folded them on the desk. You did the right thing by leaving. Evelyn, he said, and I hope someday you'll understand how close that call was. I left his office with the image of his shaking hands burned into my mind. Hands that belonged to a man who had seen too much and said too little. By the afternoon, I was called to the dean's office. The assistant at the front desk offered me water. Her voice low, eyes avoiding mine as if she already knew something I didn't. Dean Rodriguez stood when I entered. He was a tall man with a warm tone usually, but that day his voice carried a gravity that pressed down on the room. Mrs. Mercer, please, sit down. I obeyed. My palms were damp against my notebook. He rested his hands on the desk. I know you've spoken with Professor Graham. Yes. I said. He told me Chad was under investigation, but no one's explained why. He exhaled slowly, then pulled a thin folder from the corner of his desk. Before I show you this, I need you to understand we're dealing with something serious. The investigation wasn't about plagiarism or misconduct. It was about safety. The word landed heavy. He opened the file. I saw printed screenshots, social media posts, messages, grainy photos. For a second, I didn't recognize the face in them. It was mine. My throat closed. What is this Chad Nolan? The dean said carefully. Had been creating online accounts to target you. He posted edited photos and mocking captions. Some of them turned violent in tone. 2 weeks ago, the university's cybersecurity team found a private group where he'd been talking about staging a prank in class. It wasn't harmless. I leaned back, my stomach twisting. He wanted to humiliate me. Yes, Rodriguez said quietly. And based on what was written, it could have gone much further. Professor Graham alerted us when he overheard Chad talking in the student lounge about making the old lady famous. That's why we coordinated with police. The arrest was planned for yesterday morning. I tried to breathe evenly. He could have done it while I was sitting there. That's why Professor Graham acted fast. He said he wasn't supposed to warn you, but he did anyway. It was the right call. My voice cracked. Why would someone hate me that much? The dean hesitated. Sometimes it's not hate. Mrs. Mercer, it's power. You walked into their world and refused to be ashamed. That kind of quiet courage unsettles people who've never had to earn respect. I looked at the photos again, my image distorted into something cruel. I thought of every time Chad had laughed too loudly, every joke I had forced myself to ignore. I thought it was just teasing. I whispered, disbelief heavy in my chest. Just careless kids. He closed the file. It wasn't. And it's over now. He's been charged, and he's banned from campus. But I need you to take time. Talk to someone if you need to. I nodded. Though my mind was still in that classroom, the one where I'd sat just a few feet from danger, never realizing it was looking right back at me. When I left his office, the hall felt too quiet. Every step echoing like a reminder of how close everything had come to breaking. That evening, I tried to make tea but spilled half the water before it reached the cup. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. The kettle hissed, echoing through the empty apartment like a warning I couldn't turn off. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the folder the dean had let me keep. My face stared back from one of the photos warped. Cruel, unrecognizable. When the knock came, I didn't move. Mom, It's me, Daniel's voice. I opened the door and stepped aside. He didn't wait for an invitation, just came in. Eyes sharp, jaw tight. He took one look at the papers spread across the table and went still. Is this what they showed you? He asked. I nodded. He made those. My voice cracked. He planned to humiliate me in front of everyone. They said it might have turned violent. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, like he was holding back a storm. You shouldn't have to live through that. I thought I was strong enough to ignore it. I whispered, but I wasn't. I almost quit last month. He turned to me then, his voice low but fierce. Why didn't you tell me? Because it felt childish. Who wants to hear their mother complain about bullies? He knelt beside me, his hand covering mine. You don't complain, Mom. You survive, but you don't have to do it alone. Something inside me gave way. I started crying, the kind that steals your breath. He said nothing, only stayed there solid, silent. A grounding presence until my trembling eased. After a while, I managed to speak. I keep thinking, if I'd stayed in that classroom. He stopped me gently. Don't. You're here. That's what matters. I looked at him, seeing traces of his father in the way he held his anger back for my sake. I can't go back there tomorrow. I said, yes, you can, he replied softly. Because if you don't, he wins. And you didn't come this far to give up now. He stood, poured the tea I'd abandoned, and slid the cup toward me. You taught me to stand up when I was scared. Now it's your turn. I nodded, the warmth of his words sinking deeper than the tea ever could. 3 days later, I walked back into the building that had started to feel like a stranger's house. The whispers reached me before I even entered the classroom, softer this time, uncertain, as if people didn't know which version of me to face. When I stepped inside, conversations stopped. A few students looked down at their phones. Others stared openly, then quickly looked away. My seat in the second row waited. Notebook still there from the day everything fell apart. I sat down. The chair creaked, loud in the silence. A girl I barely knew leaned over. Mrs. Mercer, she whispered. I'm sorry about what happened. I turned slightly toward her. Thank you, I said. You didn't do it. Her eyes dropped to her desk. No, but we laughed. Before I could answer, the door opened. Professor Graham entered, carrying a stack of folders. He didn't make an announcement or look for sympathy. He set the papers down, adjusted his glasses, and said, "Let's begin." His voice was steady, the same as always. But when his eyes met mine, he gave the smallest nod acknowledgement. Not pity. It was enough. As he spoke, I noticed the students listening harder than usual, their laughter replaced by quiet focus. When he asked for volunteers, a boy from the back raised his hand and said, "Mrs. Mercer, would you like to go first?" The room turned toward me. Waiting, I straightened in my chair, my pulse calm for the first time in weeks. "All right," I said. "Let's start from where we left off." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, they began taking notes again. The air shifted, not quite comfortable, but respectful. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was silence without ridicule. And for the first time, that was enough to keep me standing. Weeks later, the classroom felt different. The laughter that once filled it had thinned into something quieter, more careful. I stood at the front of the room, holding the printed copy of my paper, Resilience Across Generations. Professor Graham leaned against his desk, arms crossed. "Whenever you're ready, Mrs. Mercer." My throat tightened around the words. "Thank you." I took a slow breath and began. Resilience isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like showing up when everyone expects you to disappear. A few heads lifted. The tremor in my voice faded as I spoke. I told them about loss, about starting over, about the strength it takes to walk into a place that reminds you of everything you've missed. I left names unsaid, but every sentence carried the full weight of those weeks. When I looked up, they weren't smirking or whispering. They were listening. Halfway through, the door opened. Daniel stepped in quietly, standing at the back of the lecture hall. Our eyes met, and something in my chest steadied. I continued reading, each word landing clearer than the last. Resilience isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to move through it again and again. When I finished, there was silence. Then a ripple of applause that grew until even Professor Graham joined in. His expression unreadable, but proud. As I gathered my papers, Daniel met me at the door. "You did it," he said softly. I smiled. "No, we did." He shook his head. "You were the one who stood there." For the first time, I believed him. Standing at the threshold of that lecture hall, I felt something stronger than fear, the quiet forgiveness I'd finally given myself. The sun was sinking behind the old elm trees when I sat by the campus fountain, the one I passed every morning on my way to class. The water's slow rhythm matched the quiet in my chest. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like an intruder here. I heard footsteps and turned. Professor Graham was walking across the courtyard, his satchel slung over one shoulder. When he saw me, he stopped. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, his voice softer than usual. "I was just heading out. I watched your presentation earlier. You taught them something I couldn't." I smiled faintly. Maybe I just reminded them what it means to show up. He nodded once. Sometimes that's the hardest lesson. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The breeze carried the scent of wet leaves and late autumn. I looked down at the water, its surface catching the last of the light. I keep thinking about those 6 words. I said quietly, "Leave the classroom now. Don't ask." "You did the right thing by listening." He gave a small, tired smile. "I'm glad you listened. They used to laugh when I walked in." I whispered. "Now they listen." Professor Graham tipped his head in respect before walking away, leaving me with the sound of the fountain and the calm that comes after survival.